Well, here we are again, ready to finish up what we were starting last time. Last time we were working from an outline with the title, "The Collectivization of Agriculture in the First Five-Year Plan, 1928 to 1932." Still working from that same outline, I want to complete the discussion of the topics that are listed on it. And these topics, they range from Japan seizes Manchuria, down to Trotsky warns about Hitler. Actually, to talk about the rise of Hitler and the Comintern generally, and how we can generalize about the whole period from the start of the Bolshevik regime in 1917 to the advent of Hitler to power in Germany. So I wanted to finish up with those things. Today. Still thinking about the book review, and the book review. I don't know. I'm weighing the possibility the book review might be optional. In fact, that might be a good idea. If you have some thoughts about this and some suggestions, I'd be willing to entertain them. You can send your thoughts to the forum on iLearn, and give me an indication what you think you'd like to do during the semester. Maybe at some point in the semester we could have some kind of discussion about what's happening to the world, because it is indeed earth-shaking, and from the standpoint of a historian, we are really at a colossal moment in world history. I'm sure you'd like to say something about it, and have some kind of a discussion about it. And if you have some thoughts, let me know. I can pose some questions to you as we go on. Hope you're still all with it. Hope you're still all taking this course. It's a good idea, I think, for us to press on and press on with our work, even despite the enormity of the thing that we're going through, because I think it'll help focus our mind and distill our spirits. I'm talking about spirits and distillery. That's alcohol metaphor, I guess, that slipped in there. All right, so let's finish talking today about the collectivization of agriculture in the first five-year plan, the period 1928 to 1933. Last time we were talking about the Cold War between Britain and Soviet Russia, and we made some mention of Kemalism as a policy of the Soviets during that period. I think that Kemalism definitely describes the attitude taken by the Soviets toward the national movements, as you see them. National movements ranging around the world island, from the Chinese Revolution, the Soviet support for Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists against the British. Bear in mind, this is against the British Empire. If the Chinese nationalists had got their way, they might have tossed the British Empire out of its treaty ports and out of the Yangtze Basin. Who knows? At any rate, they gave every promise of being an anti-imperialist movement. They were cooperating closely with the communists. And also, I think we have to note that the Soviet Union is their main arms supplier, their main organizer, and the Chinese nationalist movement, not the Communist Party, but the nationalist movement, the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek. It looks very much like a little Red Army. It's trained at the Whampoa Military Academy by Soviet instructors, and has kind of a Lenin-like discipline in the Kuomintang Party, although it's not a communist party. It's only a nationalist party, presumably revolutionary, anti-imperialist nationalist party, and the communists are cooperating very closely with it. So it's very close to the model of Kemal in Turkey, and that's in China. And then we said also that they were flirting with the kind of Kemalists in Afghanistan, Amanullah Khan. They were sending their propaganda down from Tashkent into the Indian market by way of revolutionary Soviet-sponsored radio broadcasts. They were encouraging the Persians in their resistance to the British, such as it was, and they definitely have won a victory in Turkey, when Turkey and Kemal actually win the day against the Turks and defeat British aims at the Straits, and in fact bring down the whole Lloyd George government. So that's a big victory by the Soviets, and their policy, as we were describing it last time, as national self-determination, or excuse me, national Bolshevism. Okay, so talking about those things, we had gone on to the question of the agricultural question in the grain strike of 1928. We discussed the debate in the party, Buharin's position, go easy on the peasant, and just more or less wait for future developments. Then we talked about the criticism of the left opposition. We need a socialist offensive within the NEP. This is pretty close to what they ended up actually doing. Then we talked about the very radical position of Yevgeny Preobrazhensky, and that is pretty much what they did do, collectivized agriculture by force and made the peasant pay for the industrialization of the country. In view of the fact, as Preobrazhensky put it very sharply, in view of the fact that they were simply not going to get the help from the West that they might have hoped for, and they're not going to get the help, certainly not going to get the help from the German Revolution as it was coming. I mean, that is to say, it was not really developing. Okay, so then we talked more about the rise of Stalin, and in view of the big collectivization campaign, the promotion of the cult of Stalin as the leader who's taking us through this difficult period, you know, the great leader. You see nowadays in the worldwide quarantine against the COVID-19 epidemic, you see various individuals coming forward and saying that they are the great leaders who are going to take us through this crisis, and everybody rallies around a great leader. We're all looking for real leadership that's going to take us through this difficult period, and that's pretty much what we're talking about with the rise of Stalin. Not to compare anybody today, Viktor Orban in Hungary or anybody else, not to compare them with Stalin, but just to compare that phenomenon of looking for the leader in the time of crisis. And then we talked about the actual mechanization of the countryside, how it affected peasant life, how the Stalinists depicted this, their campaign against the kulak, and in effect their attempt to teach socialism in a sort of a strange way, you know, teach socialism to the peasants. And we said the tour de force on the countryside was matched by a tour de force in the city, in the industrialization program, the first 5-year plan. The 5-year plan, the great blow against imperialism, we were saying last time. And then we talked about what happened in foreign policy, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, we said. Then we talked about the Litvinov Protocol, the attempt to take advantage of that, and the Soviet program of bilateralism in diplomacy. They're trying to get bilateral treaties with various people who the Soviets are afraid might join in some kind of intervention against them. Remember, their whole policy is organized around the idea of fighting off some rerun of the Allied intervention back in the early days of the revolution. Remember, it's not even 10 years old, as we were saying last time. So this policy more or less bears fruit. They get non-aggression pacts. They get people to sign the so-called Litvinov Protocol. They even get the French, the sponsors of this anti-Russian bloc in Europe, that is to say, the bloc of the Baltic states, Poland, and the Little Entente against Russia. They even get France to sign a non-aggression pact with them in 1932. So that is really the crown on the edifice of this really very astute, sharp policy by the Soviet diplomats, getting these non-aggression pacts and securing the Soviet Union at least, you know, a measure of security for the time being against this threat. So remember that this whole perspective on the thing is in the war scare of 1927. They may seem to have overcome this war scare, both with internal resistance and with this astute diplomacy of bilateralism and turning a peaceful face, hopefully, making peaceful appeals, or appeals for peace at any rate, to the West. And it seems reasonably successful by 1932 or so. But then we talked about the problem that comes up very sharply with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. So that sets things off in a different direction. That more or less brings back the problem they thought they were facing in 1927, that the Japanese were going to be trying to occupy Siberia. And they're practically on the way, because one of the first things they did was to occupy the Chinese Eastern Railway. And the Soviets immediately know they can't defend the Chinese Eastern Railway. And this is the railway that runs between Chita, near Lake Baikal, to Khabarovsk. No, not to Khabarovsk, to Vladivostok. And it runs right through Manchuria. And so the Soviets have been running this rail line. It's a Tsarist project, you remember, from the 1890s. That the Soviets have been running this line, but now they're certainly not going to be able to defend it against the Japanese. And so they offered immediately, upon the Japanese occupation of Manchuria, to sell the Chinese Eastern Rail line to the Japanese. And they're going to be dickering about the price. You see the price going down dramatically between 1931 and 1935, when they finally did sell the thing to the Japanese. And that fall in the price gives a very precise numerical indication of the relative power of the two countries in the Far East. You can see the Soviets imagine that the Japanese are their principal problem. And as a matter of fact, this is a fact, and not really up for debate among historians, that for the Soviets, up until about 1936 or so, the main enemy in the world is the main problem for the regime. I should not say the main enemy. They're not going to go about attacking anybody, but the main enemy in the world is Japan until 1936. Then the thing starts to shift. And they start to take Germany more seriously as an enemy, even more seriously than Japan. But Japan still maintains a serious military threat in the Far East, and they're going to be fighting 3 different campaigns with the Japanese, 37, 38, and 39, which we'll talk about in a little more detail, even while the threat of Hitler is looming in the West. So often Japan is ignored in all of this when we think about the rise of Hitler and the threat of Hitler to the Soviet regime and to the rest of the countries of Europe and all the rest of that. We forget about the Japanese, but they're rather important here. Then we also noted that the Japanese are very much opposed by the United States, which sees them, Japanese imperialism in the Far East, as the violation of all that is holy in the world of the normative order of the world, all that is holy in the legal and normative world of treaties and peace-loving peoples and all the rest of that. Most European imperial statesmen, you still have to think of the British and the French certainly in this language, most imperial statesmen think this is a big joke. The Americans getting so up in arms, so hot under the collar about peace treaties and things like that. And this is just their way, I think, though, of saying not that they have a fundamental philosophical difference with the United States, but they have a difference with the foreign policy of the United States, and especially with the problem of Japan as the United States sees it. Because the British, for example, do not see Japan as a big threat. The French don't see Japan as a big threat. In fact, they're fellow, fellow annexationists in the Far East, which the British and the French can make deals with, as they were doing prior to World War I, can make deals with because they want to divide the Far East, and especially China, want to divide China into spheres of influence. And so there's a more practical point of view that's represented in the description of British foreign policy that is made by most British historians writing even to our day. But American policy is different here. American policy is not violently opposed to the imperial policy of the British and the French toward Japan, but it is opposed to the Japanese getting the upper hand in the Far East, and especially in China. So the United States is going to defend, in effect, the territorial integrity of China. That's not high on the British agenda. There's a big difference of opinion between the United States and Britain on the question of Japan. The British are still thinking of Japan as an ally of some sort. You know, they had this alliance from 1902. They had to break it in in 1922, at the time of the Washington Naval Conference. The United States made them get out of Siberia, made the Japanese get out of Siberia, and broke up the Japanese British Pact of 1902. But the British still feel that this continues somehow, this relationship with Japan, and especially in the Chamberlain government, when the appeasement of Hitler comes on in a very serious way. You're going to see Chamberlain once again looking back to the Japanese as a valued ally of the British. So that's part of Chamberlain's conception, which is not at all, in no sense, the viewpoint of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the United States. No, and so you could say there's a fundamental difference between the British and the Americans about the Far East. And I guess the last thing that we were going to talk about was the rise of Hitler in Germany that occurs during this period. It's the period of the Depression. That's the main factor in all of this, the Depression from this point on. Soviets are not sunk in depression, not at all, but they're sunk in this big military campaign to modernize their country, which is going to change them from top to bottom. But the rest of Europe is sunk in the Depression, especially Germany, which really suffers in the Depression, perhaps as much as any country in Europe, maybe more than any country in the world. And the rise of Hitler is the thing that's on the agenda. Here you see a Bernard Partridge, once again, the Punch cartoonist, with Hindenburg, the president of the regime since 1926, and with Franz von Papen, a Catholic statesman, a very slick wire puller, who helped Hitler to come to power, smoothed over the trepidations that Hindenburg had about Hitler, and finally convinced Hindenburg that Hitler could be brought into power and that he could be controlled while he crushed the communist movement and the other Democrats in Germany, and then discarded at some point. So this is the bill of goods that Papen sold to Hindenburg. What are the communists supposed to do about Hitler at this point? So here you have a big debate among historians about the policy of the Comintern. Comintern policy changes at this point from a policy of what might be called a united front. They take the view from 1921 up to about 1928 or so. They take the view that the communist parties in the West have to combine with the Social Democrats. They have to use moral force to try to keep their governments on good terms with the Soviet Union. That's more or less the policy, a policy of a united front. And when the Soviets turned to the collectivization of agriculture, in the general shift to the left that takes place, they turn to a policy which they call the third period line. So the third period, they say we're in a third period of Comintern activity. First period was 1917 to 1924, when there were chances of revolution. And we communists all over the world had to prepare for a revolution. Second period, 1924 to about 1928 or so. Second period, a period of stabilization, when there were no revolutionary opportunities, when we had to hunker down and prepare for the future. Now the period 1928 from that point on, that's a period when new revolutionary opportunities will be opening up. So they said this before the Depression struck. Kind of an interesting case of communists, Marxists, whatever, predicting the future and saying that there was going to be a period of crisis in the West. And 1 year later, stock market crash and the onset of the Great Depression. So there's their big revolutionary opportunity. At any rate, this is the way the Comintern presented it. That was their line, the third period. Under the conditions of the third period, communists are not supposed to make any common cause with social democrats. So this means the German communists won't join with the German social democrats to stop the rise of German fascism and Adolf Hitler. They won't join to help the social democrats. So many have argued, Trotsky certainly made the argument very strongly, but not just Trotsky. Many have argued that this was a really terrible, fatal policy pursued by Stalin, suicidal policy pursued by Stalin when he had the opportunity of making this combination with the Social Democrats and stopping Hitler somehow. That's the argument, stopping Hitler. And the communists failed to do so. And of course, they bear some responsibility. I mean, not the bulk, but maybe some responsibility for the rise of Hitler to power. This controversy was alive as late as the Gorbachev regime in the 1980s, and communists still wanted to talk about it, still wanted to review it and wonder if there hadn't been a fatal policy mistake there in not combining against Hitler. Was it such a mistake? Was it so fateful as all of that? What would it have meant? Let's say a couple of things about that, but maybe in a more fundamental way. Was it really true that the policy of the third period was a policy of isolation in politics altogether? That might be commonly assumed in much of the argumentation about this, but I don't think that's quite right. The policy was a policy for the promotion of what the German communists called in 1931 a national revolution. So the Germans were willing to make common cause with German nationalists. And they were willing to make common cause in order to promote a new kind of revolutionary regime that would liberate Germany from the chains of its Versailles peace. So that is the policy of revisionism of the communist foreign policy. You know that in terms of foreign policy, the communists are, or I should say the Soviets, are devoted to the idea of resistance to the Versailles Treaty. That would mean sticking up for Germany if it wants to short the British and the French on reparations payments and fight them in any way. It would mean supporting Germany. So policy of revision of the Versailles Treaty, that's the foreign policy of the Soviets. Is it consonant with the Comintern policy? Now, my argument has been that these two are not at odds. A lot of people argue the reverse, that they're constantly fighting each other, and that the diplomats want to make peace and the communists want to make revolution. True enough, that's a fundamental contradiction, but that overlooks the fact that the Soviets, pulling the strings behind this policy, are trying to make those two lines revisionism, that is to say, opposition to the Entente imperialists and promotion of German nationalism on the one side and revolution on the other. And indeed, a person like Karl Radek has been preaching this to the German ruling orders for some years now, and telling them that it's all in the Bismarck tradition, that Germany and Russia always have to march together, and the left in Germany, it's the only way of linking up with the Russians and creating this German-Russian cooperation, which was essential to Germany's glory back in the 19th century. That's not wrong. Radek has this fairly shrewdly in mind as he preaches this to the Germans, and there's a certain amount of sentiment, especially in the German army, a certain amount of sentiment in Germany. You might say that those who think patriotically in the purest sense in Germany, they look to Russia. It's an interesting thing when you consider that it was the German nationalists under Hitler who attacked Russia eventually. But I think at this time you have to say that the patriotic point of view looks toward Russia. It's the other point of view that wonders about that policy. you might say that there's a point of view in Germany that takes the view that the industrial order in Germany is getting totally out of hand. Social democrats can't be tolerated. The communists are rising and making the social democrats more difficult to deal with, and the trade unions. We've got to have a leader. So many of these German big business and big landlords and big elite personalities suggest we've got to have a leader who can crush the trade unions for good. Wreck the party of the Social Democrats so that we don't have to worry they're going to get power by the ballot. In fact, do away with the ballot altogether. Go back to the regime that we had under the Kaiser, which was an industrial regime that was a monarchical regime. You didn't have to worry so much about the press of democracy against big business. So there is a certain amount of sentiment of this sort, for Hitler. And I would say that it's sort of represented and kind of spoken for, given voice to by Papen. But there are many other voices, and Papen is only one. Although he'll be the wire puller at the very end that makes it possible, as you see in Bernard Partridge's cartoon here, makes it possible for Hitler to come to power. So did they really have a chance, the communists? Did they really have a chance to stop Hitler? I don't know. They demanded that the Social Democrats had to be, quarantined. They were terrible. And why were they so set against the Social Democrats? My take on it is that the Social Democratic Party in Germany represented the party that was most pro-French, the party that wanted to make reparations payments and was the least nationalistic party. The Social Democrats were what might be called, or what was called fulfillmentist. They wanted to fulfill the requirements of the Versailles Treaty. They were not embittered opponents of the Versailles Order. And they were, you could say, pro-French in that sense. And that, I think, is the fundamental thing that helps us explain the animosity of the communists toward them. They're still fighting, these communists, they're still fighting to get the German nation to stand up against the French. They're still pursuing this revisionist foreign policy. So at any rate, the German communists and the German Social Democrats, they don't cooperate, and this is turning out badly because maybe there was an opportunity for them to cooperate and thwart Hitler on his emergence to power. And more than that, there was even a theory that was kicked around inside the German Communist Party that maybe it wasn't such a bad thing if the Nazis did end up getting power at some point, because they really couldn't last. They'd come and they'd go, and then maybe it would be the communists' turn. That was a statement of a communist deputy in the Reichstag by the name of, in the German parliament by the name of Ramella. He said, after Hitler, it will be our turn. Now, what is he talking about there? That is what has been called in certain contexts, that is to say, in certain contexts of historical debate, that has been called the Icebreaker Theory. The Icebreaker Theory. The theory that the German communists never could crack the power of the German Social Democrats. German Social Democrats get about 25% of the vote in all the elections in the 20s. German communists, on the other hand, they get about 15%. And actually, by 1932, they were getting something themselves close to what the Social Democrats had. And in fact, it was thinkable that one of these days the communists would get more votes than the Social Democrats. But at any rate, the communists had always had trouble making the Social Democratic workers follow them instead of their leaders. Maybe the Nazis could accomplish this for them. That's the Icebreaker Theory. Nazis would come to power and crush everybody. They'd lose all the trade unions. They'd be underground. And as an underground party, the German communists would be about the only people who'd be able to operate. That's certainly true. As an underground party, they were just the heart and soul of the resistance all over Europe in World War II. So they did have that capability that the Social Democrats probably did not have. But that means things are going to get pretty nasty in Germany if things come to that. That icebreaker theory is quite an idea. I don't know if you could say it was the whole policy, but at any rate, it got kicked around, and that's sort of part of our debate about whether Hitler could have been stopped. There was an opposition to this, and the opposition was made by Trotsky. So Trotsky is in exile in this period. He's on Principe Island in the Sea of Marmara. That's at the straits in between Europe and Turkey, in the Dardanelles, Principe Island. He's writing furiously. He's writing his memoirs, magnificent autobiography, My Life. He's writing a history of the Russian Revolution. It's going to be in 3 volumes. He's going to be writing and writing and writing from this point on, and it's all deathless literature. It's on a scale of Winston Churchill's writing. So on the Russian Revolution, Trotsky is the big historian, the way Churchill is the historian of World War II. And in these discussions, or in his journalism, I should say, during this period, Trotsky's making the argument against the communists that they're making a terrible mistake. They have to combine with the Social Democrats. They have to make a united front. This third period line is absolute nonsense. It shows the degeneration of Stalin and the Stalin leadership in Russia, and all the rest of that. Very eloquent, as everything Trotsky ever wrote. Very, very brilliantly written and very eloquent. But was he talking about the same thing that we think he's talking about? Was he saying that they could have combined with the Social Democrats and stopped Hitler? I don't think they would have stopped them at the ballot box. Not at the ballot box. And I don't think that they would have had any kind of peaceful, legal way to combine to stop Hitler, especially since Hindenburg is in power, and Hindenburg could simply invite Hitler to come in as chancellor, as he did in 1933. So he's not going to invite the communists into power. They're not going to put pressure on this united front is not going to put pressure on Hindenburg and have him invite them into power. And the most logical thing is that Hindenburg will be persuaded against all his resistances, and they're considerable, to actually bring Hitler to power. And this is what happened, of course, in 1933. Now, could a united front have stopped that? I don't see how, myself. I don't see how. But what could it have done? It could have maybe started a revolution. And when you look at Trotsky's writings on this, he's not talking about an electoral bloc. When he says a united front between the communists and the socialists, he says the way we had in 1917. We got to form a Soviet, got to form workers' councils. So he's thinking in terms of a revolutionary situation and a rerun of the events of 1917 in Russia and a Soviet revolution, a workers' council and revolution of that sort. So when we put this discussion about whether Hitler could have been stopped and whether this third period line wasn't fatal, and when we give all this credit to Trotsky, as many historians do, E.H. Carr, of course, entirely sold on this argument. E.H. Carr, probably the leading historian of the Russian Revolution, leading British historian of the Russian Revolution, widely regarded, I don't regard him that way, but widely regarded as the greatest historian of his generation, the greatest historian of the last half of the 20th century. But at any rate, a great historian, of course. E.H. Carr entirely sold by this argument that Trotsky had the answer there. They really should have combined and stopped Hitler. But in Trotsky's reading of the thing, and Trotsky's rendering, that is saying, we could have combined, we communists and social democrats, to make workers' councils and have a revolution and overthrow it. Well, that's another story. I don't know. Could they have done that? Is it possible for the various elements of the left to come forward and form workers' councils and overthrow a government somehow? Is that what they did in Russia? Or was it a combination in Russia of Russia being at war and there being a big peasant war and those things combining in various ways that we described? Wasn't it that that made revolution on the order of the day for the Bolsheviks in 1917? Could those things happen without a war? And what do we mean when we say without a war? We mean some large force that pushes the soldiers of the garrison in the direction of a Soviet, a workers' council that opposes the government and eventually that transfers its loyalty, the army's loyalty, to the Soviet. That's what happened in Russia. So a lot of those factors are not present in Germany. I'm not saying that it's an iron rule that events in Russia couldn't have developed some other way. And this, of course, a lot of the communists in Russia are thinking this too. It's not, we haven't got the same situation we had in 1917, but maybe, we're going to make revolution in a new way. I don't know. Could they have made revolution in a new way? So there's no real answer to this question, but it's important for all of us as historians, I think, to look at all these debates that we see around all these issues in terms of these fundamental building blocks of events that we saw, for example, in 1917. So we're talking about the building blocks. Were the building blocks available in 1932, 1933 to the German population for it to be able to overthrow the German government and therefore stop Hitler? Well, at any rate, that's the way Trotsky put the matter. So that, I think, is the way we should talk about the whole issue. Could Hitler have been stopped? Or the issue that's connected with that was the third period line of the Comintern. Was it a tragic misconception and a tragic error and all the other things that historians have said about it? So there it is. That's the debate about what policies were involved. But Trotsky also suggests that the German communists, especially with this icebreaker idea, I don't know if we can accuse the German communists of having fallen in love with this icebreaker idea, but it certainly was something that got brooded about. Trotsky thinks this absolutely fatal, absolutely disaster, that he accuses the German communists of underestimating this Hitler movement. That's probably true. And I think probably everybody underestimated Hitler up to this point, especially the people who brought him to power. They thought they were going to bring him in. He was going to carry out the so-called national revolution. He was going to break the trade unions, crush the left-wing parties, crush democracy, and return to some kind of some sort of a dictatorship reminiscent of the Kaiser regime. Maybe one day invite the Kaiser back or something like that. That's what they were thinking, not what they ended up getting with Hitler. So the people who brought him to power were under a lot of these same illusions that Trotsky's talking about. And Trotsky says, frankly, to these communists, don't think that Hitler is going to be a passing phenomenon if he gets power. He'll come and go. After Hitler, it will be our turn. Nonsense, Trotsky says. If the Nazis come to power, they will roll over us and crush our spines like some huge tank. It's a very sharp way of putting that. Crush our spines like some huge tank. Well, that is what they did. He was right about that. That is what they did. So that's an important moment. For these communists, it's an important moment in their movement as Trotsky described it, the advent of Hitler to power, which he was going to continue to write about from this point up till his death in 1940. The advent of Hitler to power is the greatest defeat suffered by the workers' movement, as he put it, since the World War in 1914, since the crushing of the Second International and all the socialist parties marching their troops off to the great slaughter of World War I. It's the greatest defeat they've ever suffered up to this point. And as a matter of fact, what it is eventually going to suggest to Trotsky, not just in 1933 or so, but a couple of years later, 5 years later, it's going to suggest to Trotsky that there has to be a brand new communist movement led by him. Trotskyism, real Trotskyism. We've been saying up till now that Trotskyism is something everybody made up. Ruth Fisher made it up. Zinoviev made it up. Stalin, Bukharin, they all went along with the big lie of Trotskyism, so-called. Now there's really going to be a Trotskyism. But of course, it won't be a big, powerful movement at all. It'll be a literary movement more than anything else, an intellectual movement, a historian's movement more than anything else. But I guess it does mark the moment that we have reached in 1933. It's the transformation of the whole story of the Russian Revolution. Up to this point, the Russian Revolution has been a revolution against war. And it has made use of war in order to stay in power. But now it's going to have to march right into another war. And this war is going to be exactly on the scale and with the alignment of 1914. Now, of course, it's been a grander scale than 1914, but it'll have roughly the same alignment. So the Russians, who've broken with the Entente, are now going to be pleading with the Entente from this point on, as soon as they realize what's happened to them. They're going to be pleading with the Entente for some kind of alliance, some kind of combination against Hitler. And this is going to be a completely different tack, completely different approach for the Russian Revolution. Then let's step outside the Russian Revolution and look at it from the standpoint of the whole world. Now that Hitler's come to power, is the Russian Revolution the biggest problem the human race has to face? Or are there other things even worse than the Russian Revolution, against which the Russian Revolution may turn out to be some kind of boon, some kind of salvation? So that's the issue that we have to contend with. We start to contend with from this point on. So I'll break this thing off at this point and make these videos available that you can access on iLearn. Hope to continue our discussion as we march through the course. Let's not lose heart. Let's not get all depressed by the quarantine we're going through and by the towering economic events that we're going through. Let's talk about them. If one of you doesn't start the conversation, I'll pose some questions to you and send them out by email and see if there's any interest in discussing any of these big matters. But in discussing the big matters that are important to us today, let's not lose sight of our job as historians to interpret the past in terms of world historical consciousness. Somehow, I know it's not easy to see. In fact, it's not easy for me to see. But somehow I feel that understanding the past will still help us in some way in understanding the future as it unfolds. Okay, so next time we'll talk about the period after Hitler comes to power, when the whole world gets turned around, when there's a transformation of all values, a reversal of all the signs. And we'll start that shortly, and you'll hear from me shortly.